The year was 2000, the beginning of a new millennium. The next generation of consoles was just getting started. But forget all about that. Kirby 64 just released. It was a landmark title in the Kirby series, building on ideas from Dreamland 2 and 3, along with having, for the first time, 3D visuals. Naturally, with Kirby 64 releasing, and Project Dolphin releasing soon, you'd expect the next console Kirby to be coming soon as well. This wondering would soon end in 2002, when Nightmare in Dreamland released for the Game Boy Advance. And it was a remake. You know, that makes sense, having a remake on a handheld where the series started, and also a good anime tie-in. It's definitely a fun and neat in-between title before the next console game. And the next console game did come in 2003, when Kirby's Air Ride finally released. A racing game. Air Ride was still incredibly interesting and cool, but where was the next platformer title? Well, in 2004 it finally came, with Kirby and the Amazing Mirror, which was once again on the GBA and not even made by HAL. But during E3 2005, after 5 years of waiting, we finally saw it, the next console Kirby. This game brought back partners from Superstar, and a lot of the cool enemies from Air Ride, along with the cleaning and water abilities back from the anime. Must have been something cool to look forward to if you were a Kirby fan at the time. If it weren't for the fact that it didn't get shown after that E3. What was happening? Clearly HAL was developing a big new console Kirby title, but every time a new game released, it was a spin-off, or on a handheld, and none of them were even made by HAL's main team. What we now know is this console Kirby had a very rough time in development. It ran through 4 phases. The first was a prototype we saw at E3, which was originally supposed to release close to Air Ride, but things didn't work out, and the project was restarted. The next was a prototype for a full 3D Kirby platformer, but they weren't ready to make that yet, and the ideas in their prototype weren't developed enough to make into a full game. The third prototype had a pop-up book art style, but one thing led to another, and this prototype was cancelled as well. The developers of this Kirby game were still stuck on the idea of multiplayer, but for this final prototype, they decided to have a single-player focus with multiplayer built on. This prototype was completed, and 11.5 years after Kirby 64, finally released as Kirby's Return to Dreamland.
I haven't beaten this game in 9 years. It's nothing at all about the quality of the game, I just keep losing motivation to go back. I hear some pretty mixed reception about this one. Some hail it as one of the best Kirby games in the series, and others say it's just alright. I think it's time for me to replay it and see what I think. Was this game worth the 11-year wait? Or was it a return for nothing? That's what I aim to find when I'm covering Kirby's Return to Dreamland.
The game starts with an opening cutscene explaining the story. DDD, Bandana D, the best character, and Kirby are playing around while Meta Knight is trying to read, when suddenly a dimensional rift appears, and out comes out a giant spaceship. This ship then crashes and loses many of its parts on the way down. Bandana D and the gang decide to check and see the damage. Inside, they find a little guy, who is seemingly the ship's owner. He's knocked out. Once he regains consciousness, he stresses out about how all the parts of his ship are gone, and has no idea what to do. Kirby and friends volunteer to help him out, and he's incredibly gracious, showing them the first one of his ship parts is in a place called Cookie Country. Your goal as Kirby is to regain this first part, and the 4 others, while collecting energy spears along the way. From here you have the option to go directly to Cookie Country, or to head back to the ship. Let's cover the ship first. Magolor's ship, the Lore Starcutter, holds a good bit of secrets, along with your rewards for collecting energy spears. You can talk to Magolor if you'd like, and he'll give you some cool information, a lot of which is about the series lore. I do enjoy Kirby lore, however, I usually like to consume it separately from the games, and focus on the gameplay. There's also a lot of videos online going over Kirby lore, so I won't be able to explain much that hasn't already been explained considering my minimal knowledge. The rest of the ship holds the game's extras and minigames. Energy spears unlock 3 different things in the ship: the minigames, ability rooms, and challenge stages. The ability rooms house every ability in the game, other than Sleep, Mic, and Crash, to test out at your leisure. As for the ability selection itself, it's alright. Definitely not Kirby's best, but there's some cool stuff here. High Jump, Needle, and Tornado are very interesting ones that you don't see in every game, and I like how many abilities, including the aforementioned ones, are expanded upon. I mention Needle and High Jump because the new additions to their movesets actually make them some of my favorites in this game. High Jump makes you feel like a superhero, with even more powerful flight than regular Kirby, and Needle is just simple fun, especially the dash attack. Tornado is improved as well, and as always, it's very enjoyable to move around with it. The newly introduced abilities are also really cool, but we'll get to those later. Moving on to this title's minigames. They're kinda weak. This is the major place you're going to see motion controls, with Ninja Dojo focusing on motion and Scope Shot focusing on the pointer. Ninja Dojo is a score-based game where you try to hit targets at the right time to get the most points. Scope Shot, on the other hand, focuses on dismantling robotic versions of iconic Kirby enemies, with a super scope-like rifle. These are both decently fun, can be played in multiplayer, and have a good amount of replay value. But the real meat in the lore Star Cutter is the challenge stages. Throughout the game, you'll unlock 7 of these stages, focusing on speeding through courses based on specific abilities, or, in the final one's case, the items you find throughout the game. In these rooms, 100% built around specific abilities, you really see how much can be done with them. They're incredibly fun and interesting because of this. Instead of being completely time-based, you are given a score. This is based on your time, the coins you collect, and the enemies you defeat, along with a few other factors. Getting gold on these can actually be incredibly hard, but I was able to muscle through it. Nope, not doing those. You technically only need bronze medals to 100%, and gold was already hard enough. Maybe one day I'll do them, but for now, we're moving on. Now into the gameplay. First off, you arrive in Cookie Country. The first stage here is a pretty nice introduction to everything Kirby and what's unique to this game. The level starts with a quick tutorial to the controls, something later games in the series would also do. However, this tutorial is completely skippable, and by all means, you can just ignore it. After this tutorial segment, you're sent into a cave where you're introduced to the first of many items you'll encounter throughout this game. These items enhance your abilities, but also remove your ability to fly and inhale as a trade-off. The first one is a key which you need to open a door very soon after, netting you the first energy spear. As mentioned earlier, these are scattered across levels to unlock challenge rooms in the lore Star Cutter. There's a good variety in the way you collect these, though most of them are collected through solving simple puzzles or using certain abilities. None of these are super challenging or annoying to collect, except for one of them, which we'll get to later. The next major mechanic you're introduced to is the Super Inhale, allowing Kirby to inhale bigger blocks and such. This is a mechanic in previous games, but what's new here about it is it requires motion controls. Not much interesting here, so we're moving on. In the room following, you see the major mechanic of this game, super abilities. The first of these is the Ultra Sword, a sword that can swing through practically everything. Many of these super ability segments are flashiness over function, but they get cooler as the game goes on. They all culminate in destroying some kind of giant object, or solving some kind of challenging puzzle, which opens up a portal into an alternate dimension. Other dimensions, if there even is one, is probably the theming of this game, and it plays into a good few elements of the game. These segments end with mini-boss fights against enemies called Spear Doomers. There are a few different types of these, and you're always going to be given different abilities to face them with, and different arenas to fight them in, so even if they are similar, each one feels at least a little unique. Once you finish the first of these fights, stage 1 is over. The progression of this stage shows the core elements this game has at display, the variety in theming, the items you carry to add more to platforming, the super abilities, and the dimensional portals. Each stage has similar progression. Instead of expanding upon mechanics throughout the level, each room seems to throw you a new idea or surprise, whether that be a reimagining of a mechanic from earlier in the game, or something entirely new. Some mechanics are kept throughout the whole level, but nothing overstays its welcome. Later on in level 1, Monster Flame, another super ability, is introduced. This is the weakest of the bunch, but there's a cool segment with it later on where you destroy a giant sunken ship. Other than that, there isn't much to talk about. At the end of the level, you encounter your first boss, Wispy Woods. Well, the other bosses in this game are unique to this one. They couldn't go without a wispy fight. Bosses in this game are pretty fun, albeit easy to defeat, which does raise a problem which we'll have to get to later. It's also just nice not to have a DDD or a Meta Knight fight for once. Which reminds me, multiplayer. While this game is built for single player first, a multiplayer option is present. The second through fourth players can choose between another Kirby, or choose Meta Knight, DDD, or possibly even Bandana Waddle Dee. You should pick Bandana Dee. He's pretty cool. Multiplayer isn't all too different from the single player, however, I wasn't able to get much experience with it. That's fine though, because I honestly prefer playing platformers on my own. The single player journey is a lot more fun for me. Although multiplayer can be enjoyable as well, if done right like in 3D World. After Cookie Country, Kirby and pals arrive in Raisin Ruins. I love desert levels, but my opinion on this one has fluctuated a good bit. In the end, however, I concluded that it's pretty great. I love the new abilities introduced here, those being Whip and Water. They're both more fun and versatile than Leaf, which I didn't even mention earlier. Apparently, it's one of the most powerful abilities in this game, but I was never a fan of it initially and didn't end up using it much. Flare Beam is also introduced here, and it's used for some pretty fun puzzles later on, but for now it's rather tame. I'd say my favorite mechanic is in the Desert Temple level, when you're given an invisibility cloak and you have to try not to lose it before an area you need it for a collectible. That same item continues to find use later in the game, and it might be my favorite. This world ends in a fight with Mr. Duder. This is probably one of my favorite boss designs in the game. It's simple, but effective. The fight is pretty fun too. He juggles and throws skulls, can pack a powerful punch, and he uses some abilities borrowed from Tornado, which is cool to see. Next up is Onion Ocean, one of my favorite worlds in the game. It's so pleasant because this game handles beach and water levels so well. Part of my enjoyment also comes from the newly introduced abilities. Spear is shown off here, and it gives Kirby the same abilities as Bandana Dee, allowing him to throw spears and even use the spear as a helicopter. Effectively, it allows Kirby to cosplay as a better character. Anyway, the other new ability introduced here is the super ability Snowball. This is how you do it. This is how you make a good super ability. Rolling around as a snowball is incredibly fun, and the segments they used it in just kept getting more creative. I love this ability. Man, this is a really fun world. But is there anything I dislike about it? No. No! No! This boot. This darn boot. This boot is originally what made me stop playing the game. I was grabbing footage for my previous Kirby video, and I was having a good time. And this boot, it just squandered all of the fun for me. However, I was willing to forgive this boot, because once you get used to the controls, it can actually be very fun to use. Some segments later in the game use it incredibly well, and that helped me relieve my frustration towards it even more. This world ends with a boss fight against Fatty Puffer. I don't love this character design, but it's a pretty fun fight. Fatty Puffer's rolling ability is really strong, so you have to watch out for that. But won't stop me from beating these boss fights in less than a minute. Next up is White Wafers, the snow level. This is another one of my favorites in this game. The stage storming through little snow cottages, and the one in the snow temple are especially memorable and fun. There's also a pretty cool use of the invisibility cloak item from the desert world. You can use it to walk through ice balls. This world also introduces the Grand Hammer ability, another one of my favorites. This one is mainly used for smashing down pegs at first, but in a much later level it's used for a pretty cool puzzle. This is also where the snowball ability gets one of its best uses. It's now actually used to knock down bowling pins, which is incredibly satisfying to do. When you combine that with the fun segments running away from Scarfies who want your key, walking through ice balls, the well-placed collectibles, the pure fun of the boss fight, which we'll get to, and the enjoyment of skating through the snowy wonderland, you're in for a great time. This level ends with a boss fight against Goriah. This is another very nice design and a fun fight with a monkey who has abilities based on fighting, which ironically is what allows you to take him down in less than 45 seconds. With that, there's only one more ship part to get, and it's in Nutty Noon. This was one of my least favorite worlds initially, but I've come around to it. This level starts within the middle of the day, but slowly transitions from sunset into night, and I really like that detail. The level design doesn't hit the peaks of Worlds 3, 4, and the later worlds, but it's more laid-back fun, and I can appreciate that. The best part, though? The music. This whole soundtrack is great, but the music in Nutty Noon is some of the best out there. Skywaltz is a super lovely and underrated track, while Sky Tower was so good that it got remixes in several games following, with each also being incredible. The world ends off with a mid-boss rush, which feels like a cool way to end off this part of the game. Finally, the boss giving you the final ship part is nothing. Well, I guess we just grab it and move on. No, wait, never mind, it's a Spear Doomer. The Grand Doomer is your big boss here, and honestly that makes sense. You've been dealing with these dimensional portals and Spear Doomers throughout the whole game. Only makes sense for the final ship part to be housed in one. This is overall a pretty great fight, and has some good music too. It ends off with Kirby using the Ultra Sword to break an impenetrable barrier around the Grand Doomer. This all culminates in Kirby doing a fury swipe of slashes with the Ultra Sword, completely destroying it. A pretty cool way to end things off. In conclusion, I love Nutty Noon. It may not be my favorite stage in the game, but it's fun and charming nonetheless. Now that Nutty Noon is complete and all 5 ship parts are reclaimed, Magolor can repair his ship and return home. He first decides he wants to show you around, however, so you come with him to his home of Halcondra. Unfortunately, as soon as they arrive, a dragon named Landia, presumably the same one who knocked out his ship before, crashes the ship once again. With no way back home, Kirby agrees to help defeat Landia so Magolor can repair his ship once again, leading us into Egg Engines. At this point, all the items, abilities, and super abilities have been shown off, so these final 2 levels remix the ideas we've currently had, and switch them up with some new theming, and a couple new stage elements. I think they do a very good job with all this in Egg Engines, because it has some of my favorite levels in the game. A standout is definitely the stage where you go through a system of sewers. Not just because of the level design, but once again the music here is amazing. I wasn't sure at first, but this soundtrack is slowly becoming one of my favorites in the series. All the music in this level has very funky vibes, and I can appreciate that. The other levels in the game have their own unique vibes as well. This level ends off with a fight against Metal General. This is a pretty fun boss battle. I like his cool sword slashes and how he mixes things up with the rocket. This is one of the more challenging fights. Finally, we arrive in Dangerous Dinner, the final level of the game. It's time to defeat Landia, repair Magolor's ship, and end the game. All 3 stages here are pretty fun and challenging, and show the best uses of the super abilities in the whole game. In stage 1, Snowball once again returns, along with the super cool bowling elements from its stage in level 4. Grand Hammer returns with a new type of puzzle that really makes good use of the ability. This does a great job of showing the functionality over the flashiness by having you smash down pegs that require different pressure levels with the hammer. Stage 3 also has a pretty cool use, but I want to go more in depth with that one, since it is the final stage of the game, and there's a lot more to talk about. The stage begins with a quick vertical segment which shows off the main mechanic of this level, these giant stars which you have to dodge. In the next 2 rooms you'll have to evade them and see how they break through blocks. Afterward, there's a very cool fight against a Dubier, where the ground is moving under you, sometimes giving you abilities and healing items, adding another layer to the fight. Next up is another segment where you have to evade those stars from earlier. But this time, there's objects hidden inside the star's trajectory, sometimes 1-ups, and later on a secret door. This door holds the use of the boot I was talking about earlier. It's basically an obstacle course using it, and it's a pretty fun time. This one will net you one of the final energy spheres. This leads into a vertical segment where you use the prism shield to protect yourself from falling enemies, and later get a key. Now, onto the worst segment of the entire game. If you want one of the final energy spheres in the game, you'll have to keep this key throughout the entire next segment, which means you'll have to platform through the whole thing. The problem is, the key combined with the vertical movement makes you very limited in how you can attack. Seems fun, right? Well, it is, but there are a few elements that are incredibly annoying about it. If you fall in the lava or get hit too many times, you lose the key. This would be fine on its own, but you can't backtrack to get a new one. If you want a new one, you'll have to restart the entire level, which, keep in mind, at its shortest, is about 8 minutes long, just to get a new one. I had to do this several times, and it was super tedious and unfun. Luckily, after I finally got that, I went into one of the coolest parts of the level. Right when you enter the room, you see a mini-boss. This is strange, because they usually don't spawn until you enter their arena. Then you see it. A Super Blade Knight. You get to slice all these mini-bosses with the Ultra Sword, all culminating in slicing a volcano in half. This may be very flashy and containing very little actual substance, but god, it's so damn satisfying. Once the volcano is sliced in half, you go into the final alternate dimension segment. This uses the stars from earlier alongside the usual block-breaking affair. It ends off with not 1, but 2 Spear Doomers. Definitely a fun way to expand on things for the final level. With that, the final stage ends, and I think it does a pretty good job. Not perfect, but not everything can be. After working through 7 levels full of challenges, retrieving all of Magolor's missing chip parts, and defeating Metal General, you arrive at the final boss, Landia. This is actually a pretty challenging fight. It's all about dodging attacks, which is really hard to do in the tight space you sometimes have. Now that Landia is defeated, Kirby can finally return home with peace restored to Dreamland. Wait a gosh darn second. Magolor, what are you doing? What are you doing? Plot twist, Magolor was the bad guy the whole time. This isn't super surprising. His motivations were a bit iffy after he arrived home. What he was really after this whole time is the Master Crown, an object that gives its wearer limitless power. Landia was protecting it, which is what caused Magolor's ship to crash in the first place. Now he plans to use this power to enslave worlds, starting with Popstar. The 4 Landia dragons, now split up, aren't having any of this, and let Kirby and friends on their backs to stop Magolor's evil plan. Now for the real final level, another dimension. This is your average Kirby shoot 'em up fare. These kinds of things are strangely in every Kirby game, but I'm not against it. They're a fun way to mix things up. This segment culminates in a fight against the Lore Starcutter. This is a pretty interesting fight considering it's your hub for most of the game. After that, Magolor is able to knock down all the Landia dragons, and you'll have to fight them on your own. I thought it'd only be fitting to use the most iconic ability from this game, so I went with Water. This fight, like many others in the game, is fairly easy, but still a cool one. Near the end of the first phase, you'll have to use the Ultra Sword and other super abilities like you did against the Grandoomer, but this leads into the second phase. In this second phase, Magolor uses super abilities against you, which is a pretty interesting way to mix things up, and you'll probably see it for a good bit before the fight ends. Another dimension is overall a pretty fun final segment, but it definitely isn't the strongest part of the game. It's a nice ending that gets the job done. With Magolor defeated, the portal to other dimensions starts to close. But Landia and the Lore Starcutter save Kirby and friends, whisking them away back home, thus ending Kirby's return to Dreamland. That's not all to talk about this game though. There's also a few more extras you get after beating the game. The first of these is Extra Mode. This is a brand new way to experience the main game, with a few changes. I found it a great way to reassess my thoughts about each individual level. Certain enemies are bigger, your health is reduced, and the dimensional rifts move along faster. But the main difference when it comes to Extra Mode is the mid-bosses and bosses. All of them have been significantly buffed with more aggressive attack patterns and new, stronger attacks. This is something that caused me to have several game overs in a Kirby game. The majority of these were from the newly introduced HRD free boss. This is actually an old relic of the first build of the game, and I'm glad they kept it, but it can be challenging to defeat if you don't know what you're doing. My main tip for this, use Spark. Spark is really strong in this game because you have the ability to charge up its most powerful attack just by shaking the Wiimote. That gives the ability strong ease of use and lets you charge a pretty powerful attack at a quick speed. Spark practically breaks the game at some points, which actually makes our next extra, the arena, quite a bit easier. This game has incredibly easy to defeat bosses, so it only made sense for the arena to be easy. What I didn't expect is how easy it would be. I beat it on my first try. Now, the true arena, I felt that had the right amount of challenge. It's definitely one of the easier true arenas by far because of the pretty easy bosses and how Spark makes things so simple, but it's still a decent challenge and I enjoy it. The true arena also has one final new boss, Galactonite. This guy returns from Superstar Ultra and has kind of become a series staple since. With Galactonite and the final form of Magolor, Magolor's Soul, defeated, the true arena is complete and 100% completion is achieved. So this truly and completely is the end of Kirby's Return to Dreamland.
Well, that was Kirby's Return to Dreamland. Definitely not the best Kirby game. It does so many things right. The music is great, it introduces so many cool new things to the series, I love the level design, and the collectibles are pretty fun to collect as well. But some Kirby games just set a higher bar than that. If I were to only recommend a singular Kirby game, it would not be Kirby's Return to Dreamland. I'd instead point you to Kirby Planet Robot or Kirby Superstar Ultra. However, Kirby's Return to Dreamland does what it sets out to achieve, being an enjoyable return to console Kirby after an 11-year absence. If you haven't tried this game, and you're a Kirby fan, I'd certainly recommend it. I got a lot of fun out of it. To wrap everything up, add Bandana to Smash Bros. Please. I'll see you all next time.